Welcome back to Orthodox Family Life. Today we're going to continue with some of my thoughts on homeschooling. Again, as I've said before, this is a rather large topic, and it's been difficult for me to zero in on exactly what I want to talk about first because there's so many topics and the different subjects and the different methods and the different ways of handling discipline. Like, this is such a huge topic. So I appreciate everyone's patience as I try to crack into this very large subject. So today I thought a good place to start would be in the beginning. And so I want to talk about how to lay a healthy foundation for your family, how to build a healthy family culture, and talk about the family in terms of, and the home in terms of creating a fertile place in which your children can grow. So I'm going to go through this very slowly, and I hope that it makes sense to you, the analogies that we're going to use. And then we'll jump into kind of fleshing out one example of this. And then hopefully in next videos, we'll talk about some different areas about laying the foundation. One little last caveat I want to say before I get started here is that all families are starting in this journey in different places. Some people are beginning their families from the very beginning with homeschooling and with being Orthodox. And some families are coming into the Orthodox Church having already started homeschooling, or they are starting to homeschool their children after their children have already been to public school. So these are very different situations. Today, I'm kind of addressing if you're starting from scratch. In later videos, I hope to get into um, how to move towards a healthy environment if you've already allowed some unhealthy things into your family life. So everything today I'm saying to people who are starting from the very beginning. Okay, so I want us to think about family life as a garden, and parents being the gardeners, and the children are these seeds given to us by God, and that God is asking us to bring forth fruit. And so we are really the cultivators of our family, right? And so we have to establish our family life or our family culture. Okay, so this includes what we embrace, what we reject, how we treat one another. All of that will create a family culture. And so, like any good gardener, we want to remove the rocks out of the garden, right? Rocks in an actual garden make it difficult for the roots of a plant to expand, to get all the nutrients that they need, right? So there could be things in our family life that we need to remove to allow us to grow. A gardener goes in and takes out all the thorns and the thistles, right? All of the weeds have to be removed. And the gardener has to be really careful about this. He has to get things taken out from the root and not let anything stay, right? Don't let a little bit of the root stay. If you let a little bit of the mint plant, for instance, stay, it's going to come back, right? And so gardeners who are very careful will carefully take the weeds out when they're young and before they go to seed. And if you allow these weeds to grow along with your cultivated plants, obviously your cultivated plants are not going to produce as much fruit as they would have otherwise. And lastly, the diligent gardener, puts a fence around the garden, right? He doesn't allow animals to come in and nibble on the garden, right? That fence or that wall is built specifically to protect the plants inside. So I really feel like this image of the garden is an image of what a healthy family life should look like. Parents, it's our job as gardeners to build that fence, to dig up the weeds, and to remove the rocks. It's our job to tend the garden daily, to be attentive to it, to watch it, to see where it needs a little tweaking here or there, if something is harming it, if it needs more nutrients. This is our job to do. And the whole goal of the tending of the garden, is to produce fruit, right? It's not just to have plants that are there and barely staying alive, but it's to have plants that are strong, whose roots go deep, plants that can weather an off day of not enough water or, bad weather, right? But ultimately, they're going to produce fruit. And so that's what we're looking for. Not just survive, but actually thriving and producing fruit, which was the whole point of planting the garden. Now, this may all seem very obvious to you. However, I think that our culture has become so unhealthy that there's a lot of things that we allow into our lives, into our children's lives, that are preventing them from growing well and bearing fruit. And so I think we really need to look at this with fresh eyes and to really be diligent about what we allow and what we don't allow, having really strict rules for our family. And I mean strict in terms of making choices intentionally, not just letting your children do things or watch things or read things because their friends are doing it, but that you know what's going into your garden. You wouldn't just accept, something else from someone, some pesticide or something, and spray it all over your garden, not knowing what it is or what it does. So we need to take responsibility for what is coming into our family. This is literally our job as parents. We shouldn't outsource this to anyone. So one of the problems in our times is that there are so many unhealthy messages and influences on our kids and on us as we were being raised in the last few decades that we are no longer good judges of what is healthy and what is not. And we talk about things in terms of being normal. What's a normal childhood look like? But if you look at what a normal childhood looks like today and you define the word normal as common, it's extremely not normal and very unhealthy. And so we have to be careful, and I'm going to try to clarify what I mean when I say normal. We want our children to have a normal childhood. And what I mean by that is the type of childhood that children have had for centuries. A childhood where they're allowed to play, there's a lot of freedom, but there's also strict rules and boundaries, right? That children grow up and they're humble, they're obedient, they respect their parents, they're joyful, they're hardworking. So this is what normal childhood looks like. And I think when we see children that are like this now, we're often taken aback because now we're used to children who don't make eye contact, won't talk to us, um, have to be entertained all the time, have to be eating sugar or soda or something all the time, right? We have an extremely unhealthy culture that our children are in and that we ourselves have been formed in. And so, again, we don't often see just how unhealthy it is. So, this brings me to another point. Parents can also see their job as developing the tastes of their children. So we can look at food, for instance, right? Your job as a parent is to develop a child's palate, right? You want them to enjoy healthy, simple foods. If you allow a child to eat sweets and soda, fried food, very salty food, right? Things that are unhealthy for them, unnatural food, which is all over the place now, right? We all know how hard it is to have a truly clean diet, right? So if you are allowing them to partake in all this junk food, they don't have a taste for vegetables, right? They don't think that the vegetables taste good, even though the vegetables and the more simple food is actually what their bodies need. And so, this image of developing a child's taste also works with their taste for entertainment, free time, work, study, right? Everything that we're doing, we're trying to develop a healthy desire in the child, a desire for the good things, a desire to live in freedom, really, right? Because if we are addicted to sugar, if we always want something sugary or something sweet, we're not free, right? And we know through our theology in the church and through asceticism that if we can cut those things off, if we don't have to get rid of sweets altogether, but if they're a very small part of a healthy, full, whole foods diet, then we are truly free. We're truly free to enjoy those little treats, but we're not harmed by them. And so we should look at this example of food and translate that into all the other aspects of our family life. We could use this analogy for developing taste with books as well, right? If you give your children what I call potato chip books, which are very simple books that are not well written, they are often based on a character and not a story, right? If you start giving your child these kind of books because they like Superman or whatever the character is, you're not developing a taste for good literature, a taste for complicated and beautiful stories, right? It's just that very sweet, unhealthy treat. It kind of hits a nerve and then there's nothing really there. A good book is something a child could read over and over again, right? But the potato chip books are so cheap, there's nothing there. It doesn't satisfy. So if a child tries to go from a potato chip book to something higher and better, let's say Jane Eyre, but they've grown up on potato chip books, it's going to be very difficult for them because they are not used to that kind of language, right? They haven't developed that taste for it. And so The language itself can be difficult to read, but even if they can read it, it may seem boring to them. It may take too long to get to the point, not enough exciting parts, right? And so we have to look at childhood as a time when their tastes are developing, their desires are developing, what they long for is developing. It's a temptation for us to say, oh, well, this is just a little video. This is just a little baby shark video or something, right? And it shuts them up for a while so I can have a minute to myself. But what it's really doing is it's developing a taste. It's developing a taste for something bright and overwhelming and annoying. It's intriguing, it captures them, but there's nothing good there. And it's not only that there's nothing good there, but it's preventing them from developing a taste for actual good music. And so some of the things I might talk about in the younger years might be challenging because I take a pretty strict stance of we want to give our children when they're young the very best. I believe in pretty strict sheltering for the younger years, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I also believe that you do that so that they are formed correctly and formed in a healthy way. It's not about being scared of the world or anything like that, because I also believe that by the time you get to the teenager years, you need to help your children process what they're seeing in the world, right? But they can't process that correctly if they were formed in it. So they can't see the harmful things of the world if it's been allowed for the last 15 years, right? So if it was never allowed, and now you help them to kind of begin to process the world because they're going to be adults and go out into the world. And once they see these things and they realize they exist and you talk about them, well, now they've already been formed in the good and the beautiful and the holy and the true. And they can see those things for what they really are. And there's a great freedom in that. And so while I think the younger years should be pretty restrictive, I don't think that season will last their entire childhood. It has a purpose. But just like when you plant a seed in a greenhouse, you don't put it directly into the garden often. You mostly put them in the greenhouse in the right type of seed mixture, right? It's not a normal type of dirt that you use. They're protected from too much sun, too much wind, too much dryness, too much water, right? You give them the perfect environment for that seed because every seed is different. Tomatoes are different than cabbages, right? They need different things. So for that seed, you know what that seed needs to give it the best start that it can, to help it develop healthy roots, to make sure the plant doesn't get too leggy, right? Where it won't be strong. And so this is really our job as parents, right? To give them that time when they're very young, to be very protected and to flood them with the very best of everything that we can. And then when they're ready, right, they go out into the garden and they're transplanted. But even that doesn't happen overnight, because if you take your little seedling that's been protected for two months and you put it directly into the garden, it will most likely die or it will be highly stunted. And so we see this happen with a lot of children that were protected, but maybe they were protected too much or for too long. And then they were just thrown out into the world. And we often see children, unfortunately, who really struggle with that. That's a real concern. And so, what we want to do is we want to harden them off. And that's what the teen years, I believe, are all about. It's you put them out in the garden for a little bit, and then you bring them back inside. And you put them out a little longer the next day, and you bring them back inside. This is how seeds work and small plants. But for our children, this might mean they take a college class at a university nearby in high school, and they can kind of see what's going on. And then they come home every night and you talk about it, right? And you're engaged with them, you're asking questions, and um, if they have questions, they know they can bring to you, right? They're not scared to talk to you about these things because you've developed a relationship for many years, right? And they know that you will listen. And so ideally, that's what this hardening off process looks like. They have questions about the world that they're seeing, and they bring them to you, and you, the best that you can, answer their questions and encourage them. But all of this will only work if they were sheltered in the beginning. And so, how long a child is sheltered and to what degree, that's really specific for the child and the family. So, it's not really something I can talk about specifically, but I do think you can't go wrong with giving the very best, wholesome environment for a young child. Okay, so how do we begin to make this sort of environment? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is be honest with where we're at. Again, I said if we are starting from the very beginning, and maybe you've been Orthodox for a long time, then it might look one way. If you're brand new to the church and you're still, maybe you're still reading secular books that are not the best books, or watching movies that maybe you shouldn't be watching, right? Maybe you have some work to do there on yourself, right? Because we don't want to set up one paradigm for our children and another for ourselves. This is kind of a family thing we're talking about, but it might look a little different for you. And so I think that's something you have to work through with your spouse and your spiritual father. But we always want to lean towards giving our children the very best and being honest about it. We all have things from the world that we enjoy that aren't the best for us. And I think part of being an adult is recognizing that this is something I need to lay aside for the sake of my children, right? That my children need me to be an adult. My children need to make choices about what is best for them. And it's just not about what I like. And that can be difficult sometimes, right? But that's the calling of being a parent, is putting aside what we want and doing what's best for our children. And I think that's a theme that's going to come up with many of our talks. Always putting our children's well-being first, regardless of what we want. Okay, so we need to look around and we need to look for two different things. What are the very worst things that we have in our family life right now? Maybe we have a bad habit of yelling at each other, or calling each other names or something like that. Well, that's a habit you can just throw out, right? Or maybe it's a certain book series that you feel a little tug that maybe this isn't appropriate for us and maybe we should put it aside. So you want to look at what's the very worst things that you can easily cut out. Cut those things out. And then you also want to think about the virtues, right? How can you put more positive things into your family's life, whether that's starting to pray as a family or reading the lives of the saints, doing charity together. There's so many ways that you can add the positive back in. Sometimes it's just being kind of, more kind to your children, smiling at them, making sure you're hugging them and cuddling them every day, especially if they're very young, but even through the teenage years, right? So whatever positive changes you need to make in your family, just this simple idea of what's the what's the things we're ready to lay aside. These are not good for us, and we can say goodbye to them. And what can we add? Just that simple little shift can make such a big difference in your family. And then this is a constant process. So maybe you do that, and maybe you come back 6 months later and you say, maybe we're ready to get rid of our TV. Our family didn't have a TV for many years. It was kind of an off and on thing. We wouldn't have one for a few years. We'd buy a TV and keep it for 2 or 3 months and go, okay, this was a mistake, and we throw it out again, right? Overall, we try to be pretty frugal, but with things like this, we just say, nope, it's out. If it's bad for our family, I don't care how much it costs, it's out. And so I think even our children seeing us struggle through these things, right? Because we were open with them about it, is good for them. That we don't just accept things. We don't accept things just because everyone else is doing it, but we as the parents are making it very intentional choices. We're asking for God's guidance to help us. We're asking our spiritual father. The children see this, that we are struggling to live the best Orthodox life that our family can. But if you keep your TV, then maybe you have really strict rules about, we don't just have the TV on all the time. I know that was common when I was growing up, that the TV would just be on all the time. I don't know if that's still the case, but we had very strict rules. Okay, we're only going to watch a family movie on this night of the week. The TV stays in the closet all week, and on movie night it comes out. We make little snacks. It's a little treat, right? We all watch together. It's not just something that putting people in front of the TV to get them out of the way, but we're all doing this together, and we make sure that the movie is a good quality movie. And so whatever fences you need to build around your little family, whatever rocks and weeds you need to pull up and throw out, right? Do that. And your children, you'll see a difference in them. One really interesting thing I saw in our children is that, um, and I would be really interested to hear if you can confirm that if this happens in your family or not. But for us, I noticed if I let our children watch something, they almost always argued afterwards. So if they got to watch a little movie, after the movie, they were just grumpy. They just did not get along well. And I always thought that was very interesting. So you can let me know if that happens for your family. And so that's the first part of what I wanted to talk about is laying a good foundation and this idea of cultivating a space that is healthy and allow your children freedom within that space, right? To grow in both virtue and skills and love for one another, right? You'll have this beautiful little family culture going on. And so that's the first thing I wanted to cover, this idea that it is okay and appropriate that we and it's even encouraged, I think, that we protect our families and we only allow the good things and we're constantly reevaluating that, throwing out what we can and adding in anything that helps us towards virtue. And so I want to do a series of short talks on all of these different foundational skills or principles and go over some specific areas. So, what is foundational skills or foundational ideas for um, maybe parental interaction with your children? What does that look like? But today I'm going to start with something a little more concrete, and that is writing skills. So we're going to switch over to a little bit more of the homeschooling approach, but this will still, if you're a parent and you're not homeschooling, this will still apply because this is really about the early years through probably kindergarten, first grade. And so when we're thinking about how do we create a strong foundation for writing, I think we want to talk about skills and we want to talk about knowledge. So skills are things that we do and we have to practice them to improve them. Knowledge is just stuff we know through reading or experience. So you don't teach your child to write one day and then all of a sudden they know how to write and there's nothing for them to do, right? Writing is a skill and it has to be practiced for the child to get better at it. However, writing is a pretty complicated skill. And I think what often happens for us in homeschooling is that we look at the higher level skills and we want to push them down to the younger grades. And so, what I'd like to take a few minutes to show you is that writing is actually a synthesis of many lower level skills and explain to you why it's so important to focus on those skills and what that might look like. So, I want you to imagine if you were trying to make a wedding dress and you didn't know how to sew. A wedding dress takes many different skills to create. You have to know how to use your sewing machine. You have to know how to thread the sewing machine. If you don't thread it properly, it can actually cause a lot of tangles in the thread. It took me a long time to figure that problem out. You have to know how to cut material. If it's a wedding dress, it's probably a very silky material, so the material doesn't go through as easily as cotton would, right? You have to learn how to fit the dress. You have to learn all of these special fabrics and how to use them, how to hand stitch. There's a ton of tiny skills embedded in the skill of making a wedding dress. We could say the same thing about making a 4-course meal for 40 people. If you're learning an instrument, I was a bass player for a while in high school, a string bass player. So you had to learn about the music itself, the different notes, the different rhythms, the staff, and the different scales. But you also had to know how to hold your instrument properly. You had to know how to hold your bow properly, how to switch between the bow and plucking. You had to be able to read something, learn how to sight read, complicated rhythms. And so each of these individual skills came together, especially when I played in an orchestra, right? You then had to layer on playing as a group, right? You're not just with yourself, but you have to watch the director, you have to listen to everybody else. And there's this great synthesis of all of these skills. And when you're practicing your instrument, you're often honing in on one thing, right? Maybe it's rhythm, maybe it's your the bowing, or you start slow and you go faster. You learn how to do that piece of music faster and faster. So I think we can all see that higher level skills are just a bunch of smaller, lower level skills that have been perfected, and then they are synthesized. And this is what writing truly is. So these lower level skills, what I'm calling foundational skills, are often overlooked because honestly, we get pressured to rush our children, right? We are terrified that they are behind, right? That dreaded B word, that they are not going to be where they should be. or that we just don't recognize these lower level skills because they're so ubiquitous, right? We're so used to them, we don't even think about them. It's kind of like driving a car. If you've taught a teenager how to drive, it's both terrifying, and it's very eye opening, right? Because they can't do the things that you just do naturally. You don't even have to think about putting on your blinker or slowing down to make a right hand turn, right? But for them, they have to think very hard about each of those things. And so um, we often think our children should be farther along. And I think it's because we're not recognizing and understanding those lower level skills. We're not isolating them and letting the child practice those individual skills, because that's what it takes. It takes regular practice of doing those skills correctly, right? And only then can we increase the skill level and expect a little more for them. So we want to always make sure that they start with the very basic, and once that is easy for them, then you move on. So let's think about what skills a child would need to complete a very common writing prompt. I think this is a fourth grade writing prompt, but it's a very common one, right? Write about your summer vacation. Okay, so here's all the little things that the child has to do to be able to write that. So they have to think about what they did. What did I do in the summer? Okay. Then they have to kind of remember some of the details, right? Then they have to decide which details they want to talk about and which ones they don't. Once they get all the subject figured out, which actually takes a lot of kids quite a long time to do, and some of them get stuck there, right? So once they have a subject, now they have to think of a sentence. Okay, so now they have to pick up their pencil and they have to remember how to hold their pencil. Again, this is something we don't as adults have to remember, but your child still does. They have to think about, where does their little thumb go, where are their fingers, right? And then they have to start writing. And so they have to form each and every letter correctly. They have to put it on the right spot on the line. Is it too low? Is it too high? Is it floating? Right? Um, it has to be the right size. Maybe it's a lowercase a, but they made it like an uppercase a, right? And should it be a capital or should it be a lowercase, right? Did they remember to capitalize the first letter of the sentence, right? They have to remember how to spell each of those words. Maybe even have to like wait and sound that word out before they can write it. They're doing all this while they're holding that sentence in their mind, right? And then they have to remember to punctuate it correctly, right? Doesn't need a period at the end, question mark, exclamation point. That was all for just one little sentence. And now they have to write another sentence, right? Because the assignment was to write a paragraph. So writing is a very complex skill. Now, imagine if your child has trouble with one or more of those little foundational skills. What if they haven't practiced their letters enough to be able to write them pretty quickly and easily and neatly, right? What if their spelling is so bad that they don't know how to spell any of the words they want to use? What are they going to write about? Will they sit there and just get discouraged and start to cry and get stressed out? Maybe. They might just, do their best and write with all the words misspelled. And if that happens, they're going to get their paper back with a bunch of red marks, right? Even though they tried really hard, it's going to be all marked up. And it's pretty demoralizing, right? So the whole process can be very stressful for a child and for the parent, honestly, right? It's very common for writing in the early years to end in tears. And this is why so many parents, honestly, they give up teaching their kids to write until about high school. It starts to worry them so much they think, okay, now the child has to learn how to write, and they're pretty desperate. So all of this is to show that each of the higher level skills that your child will eventually learn in upper elementary or middle school, high school, you have to look at them as a synthesis of foundational skills. We start with the foundational skills. We don't add complexity until the child has mastered the skills. Okay, writing consists of physical skills like holding the pencil, letter formation, mental skills like spelling words and remembering punctuation rules, right? And then just the thinking about what you want to say and word choice. And we shouldn't ask a child to write a paragraph until he can write a sentence. And we shouldn't ask them to write a sentence until he can write words, words until he can write letters. And we shouldn't ask them to write letters if they don't have a certain amount of fine motor skills and have built those muscles in their hands. And of course, they have to do the gross motor skills before they can go down to the fine motor skills. So there's a hierarchy of how to teach these things: gross motor skills, fine motor skills, hand muscles, letter formation, writing words, writing sentences, writing paragraphs. So if you are skipping some of those lower level things or not giving them enough time to get good at them, right? Don't move on until they're good at it, until they can write a word easily, right? And they're not stopping to think, which way does a B go? Which way does a G go? What does an uppercase K look like, right? If they're still asking those questions, they're not ready to practice what we typically think of as writing, which is give them a prompt and have them write about it. Okay, so one problem with these foundational skills that parents might run into is that they might not look like much. Okay. So again, staying with writing, um, writing for a first grader might be copying one sentence. Okay, so that means that the sentence is there for them. Maybe it's something from history or from a book that they read, right? Maybe you ask them a question and this was their answer, and it's just one simple sentence that you wrote neatly with correct capitalization, spelling, punctuation, so they don't have to think of any of that. And it's their job to write it correctly. Okay. Maybe that's building stamina. Maybe they've just moved from writing words to writing sentences. Okay. So they've written, that's their writing for the day, typically called copy work in the classical movement. So let's say the rest of the day they did math manipulatives because they're only in first grade. So they're not doing computer work or anything, but they're working with real math, you know, counting bears or scales, clocks, anything like that, like hands-on concrete math work, okay? And let's say they did some phonics with flashcards and they read 2 pages from a little reader that they have. They listened to a read aloud while playing with Play-Doh, and again, that Play-Doh is strengthening their hand muscles. Maybe they narrated back what they heard. That's kind of the thinking side of writing that they're working on. And for science, they listened to a few pages from Apologia's botany book, and they drew a little leaf that they got from outside. So after all of that work, what will you have to show for it at the end of the day? You'll have one sentence written and a picture of a leaf. But as you can see, the child actually did quite a bit of work throughout the day, quite a bit of developmentally appropriate work. So um, I think part of why the school pushes the upper level skills down into the lower grades, right? Because younger kids are pressured to be able to do these writing prompts, is because it proves that they did something. And a picture of a leaf and one little sentence is not going to cut it in most places, even though I think it is developmentally appropriate. And again, we're isolating those skills and we're working on them individually. So if the child is working on their physical handwriting, if they're working on phonics, which will eventually morph into spelling rules, phonics rules and spelling rules are the same thing, but they're flipped. If they are listening to a narration and then telling back, that telling back is the foundational skill for writing because it forces them all that thinking part of the writing. It forces them to put things in a certain order that makes sense, right? To remember, to bring up all the details. So you're separating all of those skills, right? And when they're good at all of them, then you can start combining them. Okay. And we can talk about that later. So don't worry if you get to the end of your homeschooling day and it doesn't look like much. As long as you have worked on foundational skills, you were successful that day. This truly was a full day's worth of work. And I point this out because sometimes as homeschoolers, we judge ourselves according to our public school friends or other homeschoolers. And maybe they come back with, 10 workbook pages done, right? And we start and an art project and all this stuff, right? And we start to think maybe we didn't do enough because all we have is a sentence and a little leaf. But I promise you that if you are doing these activities that are appropriate developmentally, they're isolating skills and working on them, and you're doing them regularly. That's so important. You can't do them once a week. You have to do them every day, 5 days a week. As long as you are doing that, you're laying a very strong foundation, and you will find that later on, the higher level skills will come much easier, and it will be a real joy to your children. And, a lot of workbooks, I'm not against workbooks per se. I've used them for different things and different times, but there's a lot of really low level workbooks. And if it's just, color the thing that starts with a B, that's not the same as isolating these skills and learning how to write a B quickly, carefully, in starting large and getting smaller and smaller and smaller, learning the B sound, learning to remember what B looks like, right? These are the isolated skills we're working on. So as long as you're doing that, you're doing great. So let's go over a few of the foundational skills that I think all young children should be learning. And again, I want you to think of these in terms of if they don't have this skill, what will it look like in fourth grade, in sixth grade, and eighth grade if they can't do this skill? Listening, not just hearing, but listening. If a child does not listen, then they don't receive assignments, right? If you have a child who's not listening in a high school level class, like they can't do the work, right? But we have to train our children to listen. We actually have to help them develop that skill. It's a pretty common sight to watch mothers chasing after little 4-year-olds, right? Who are saying lots of words to the child. Now come back, we're not going to do this now. We're not going to do that now. Come sit here. Come do this. There's so many words, but the child is not listening. They're just running away and, being wild. Well, this is because the child has not learned to listen to the parent. When the parent speaks, the child has to listen. And the parent needs to learn. You say as little as you need to, and you stop talking and you let the child listen to that. If you just keep talking, the child will shut you off, right? And so some of these, there's a matching thing that the parent has to learn, right? So the child needs to listen, and the parent needs to learn how to speak in a way that helps the child listen. Few words, waiting for them to reply, requiring that they reply to you, right? That's part of listening. Another one is remembering, right? If we never require our children to remember things, whether that's remember to put your shoes back in the shoe basket at the front door or remember to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom, right? If they are never held responsible for these things, they will never learn to remember things. And this could also be, just remembering little nursery rhymes and things like this. So memory and remembering things and taking responsibility for that is very important. Learning to attend or focus, right? Again, I think of that young child I see running around who is not really focused on anything. They kind of have their eyes are just kind of going everywhere, looking for the next exciting thing to look at, right? And then you see children that have the ability to focus. Maybe they're digging a hole in the sand and they're watching how the sand slowly moves down, right? And they're intrigued by it, right? That's the kind of focus you want your child to develop, and they can develop it, but there is a way of doing that, right? You only do one thing at a time. You don't jump from thing to thing, right? You give them the time and the quiet to learn how to focus on something. Again, what does that look like if you have a high schooler that can't focus, right? What if they're on their phone and they're used to being interrupted constantly, right? You can't study physics or something if your phone is constantly dinging at you, right? If your attention is being scattered and taken somewhere else. So that ability to be attentive and to focus is so important. Obedience. I really believe that young children can and should learn how to be obedient. Even just the simple practical side of obedience. If you tell your 12-year-old, I need you to get dressed and be ready to leave by 10 a.m. because we have things to do. They should be able to do that, right? You shouldn't have to nag if you don't teach them when they're young, and then you have to nag and keep reminding. This creates a lot of stress in that family. And honestly, the children will just tune you out because you're just nagging them, right? So we have to stop these really unhealthy cycles. It's very simple. You're the parent, you tell the child what to do, and they do it. This is part of being a parent. I know we don't like to hear that, but it's true. It's our responsibility to teach them to be obedient. And obedience is such a gift. I had a child who I was in the doctor's office one day and he was with me in the room. As the doctor came in, I said, actually, I'm going to have my son step out while I, was talking something medical with him. And I said, so and so go out into the hallway and go to the end of the hallway and sit down. And so he went out of the room and closed the door. And the doctor said to me, "Do you want me to go look and make sure he's, where he should be?" And I was so taken aback as I thought, "No, I told him to go sit down there and he will. I trust him." And when you have that kind of trust with an older child, there's just such a delight. The whole relationship is so delightful. It doesn't mean that they're never going to make a mistake or that you're never going to lose your temper. Those things will happen, right? You're going to have these bumps, but they should be few and far between. If you have your children learn to be obedient, and you do this in a gentle and loving way, it's not about force and anger. It's, strictness, harshness. That's not what it's about. Um, but it's such a joy to have this kind of trust and obedience with your children as they grow up. Adam Lockridge and I did a whole talk on this. You can find that on my channel, Love and Obedience, because they go together. So another skill, these gross motor skills, right? If a child isn't allowed to run around and climb trees and be on a tire swing and do all these large motor skills where you're moving your arms and your legs, they're not going to be able to sit down and do the fine work. So the way a child's body grows is you slowly gain control of your larger limbs, and as you practice that and get better at controlling your arms and legs, then you can control your fingers with finer and finer dexterity. And you can again see why this is so important. If a child is just sitting down and watching TV all the time, or they're on a tablet and they're holding it and they're looking at it, and maybe just one finger is going around swiping things, they're not developing the muscles they need to develop. And this will have obviously there's a spiritual impact about this, but if we want to just keep it on the low level, they're going to have an educational impact on this, right? They're not going to be able to write their letters. This will actually end in dysgraphia. I've seen this in middle school kids who cannot write their letters very well in middle school. They're writing like a second grader, right? And I really think this is because they're not required to go out and play, to do the digging and the jumping and all of those things with their bodies that not only relax them and relieves any kind of stress they have just from the physical activity, but it's also about muscle development and coordination that they need to develop to do well in school. Okay, so I think enough of that. There's many others we could talk about, and we will talk about in coming videos, hopefully. So the last thing I want to say is that the way that children learn these foundational skills in the early years through maybe 6 or 7 years old is primarily through play. And so you're not going to sit down with a 3 or 4 year old with a workbook and practice letter formation, right? That's really not appropriate. What they need to be doing is playing with Play-Doh or modeling clay that's a little stiffer on their hands, right? And really develop those muscles, right? The quality of the toys in your house is extremely important. If you haven't looked into open-ended toys, I suggest that you do. The idea behind open-ended toys is that they are toys that can be used in an infinite amount of ways. The classic example would be unit blocks, right? They're plain wooden blocks that can be used to create anything the child can think of, whether it's structures and train tracks or a map or a little dollhouse. Whatever the child can think of, they can do with those blocks. Open-ended toys do tend to be the high quality ones, more expensive. But if you have a lot of children, you plan on having a lot of children, if you can afford it, I would highly suggest that this is where you put your money. Low-level toys, plastic things that break, plastic things that, have flashing lights and make noise, these are just garbage. If you don't believe me, go to any thrift store and it will be full of plastic toys, of things that have characters on them, um, just useless things, useless at best. And so I'll try to develop a list of what I think is some really high quality open-ended toys, but it can be things like a sandbox where the child is playing in sand and water, hours a day. That's so good for them. It's burning their imagination, the good kind of imagination. It's helping them to grow in dexterity. They're building big things, and then they're getting finer and finer, right? If you have a sandbox, you can just add a few little plastic dinosaurs to enrich that play, or you can add a few little dump trucks and excavators, right? So there's a lot of variety that you can do there. It's wonderful for a child's imagination. They're never going to get tired of a sandbox. If you give them a little plastic toy, they're going to grow out of it. So sand is a great one. Unit blocks, and I believe there's something called a Kaplan block. I will try to link these things down below. It's a thinner block, but it's still just a plain wooden block, not painted. Um, these are fantastic for children for building different things. Even high schoolers, the Kaplan blocks in particular, they're a little thinner, so you can build like 6-foot structures, more complicated architectural structures. Very fun. That's another great thing about open-ended toys is that children of all ages can play together. It's not just exciting for the little kids. Another great toy would be Legos. Now, with Legos, I would be a little more careful because if we're talking about open-ended Lego toys, you wanna get the bricks, right? The plain brick, the classic set. The more you go into, characters and where it's building something very specific, I think those have less value, with one little caveat. My boys were really into Legos, and they love the Technic and the City series in Legos. And they love those because these have certain parts that, gears and shafts and fittings and all these things, that allowed them to create moving vehicles. And so you wanna give your kid as many, plain toys, but also maybe some of those special pieces. Other great things could be very simple baby dolls for little girls. This is something that, we often overlook these days. We think of Barbies, but I think a very traditional little baby doll is better. They can learn how to carry it around, and if you're still having children, you'll often see the little one with her baby doll will kinda mimic mom, which is very, very sweet. I'll try to put out a better list. I think I'll close for now, but you want to make sure that you have quality play, and the quality play is their education, okay? So, if you're trying to work with older children or something and you want to you tell your children to go play, you have to think of that in terms of it's still educational. Or do they have little stuffed animals and things that they're making them talk to each other, right? And they're having these adventures together. That's good, right? These are things that they're helping them to develop. So the point is you want toys that help your children to develop. One last thing, your children also need to learn to be bored. You're not there to entertain your children all day. It is good for them to be bored. Let them sit there and not know what to do. What I would always tell my children is, well, I have a very long list of chores, and if you don't have something to do, I will give you something to do. And very quickly, as you can imagine, they always find something else that they would rather do. And so it's really important that children learn to play on their own, whether or not they have an older or younger sibling to play with. It's okay if they learn to play on their own. There's so much that boredom does to spurn the imagination and to help your children grow. So boredom we'll probably do a whole talk on boredom at some point. My children in particular, when I was talking to them about some of the upcoming videos, was they wanted me specifically to tell you that they would not have done so many fun things, including building their own language, if they had not been bored. So don't worry about entertaining your children or don't put a video on for them. Let them figure it out, and they will. They might be grumpy at first, but they'll figure it out. Okay, so I think that's enough for today. Just to recap, we talked about foundational skills, laying a healthy foundation, thinking about our family life in terms of a garden. We are the gardener. We're responsible for creating that healthy environment for our children. We talked about not putting the higher level skills into the lower ages, but to really look at those higher level skills as a group of individual skills. And the younger years are for practicing those individual skills. When you do that, it might not look like much. It might not look like much to practice remembering and listening and attention and gross motor and obedience, right? You might end up with one little sentence and a leaf, if that, even less if they're younger, but it's all laying a strong foundation. I promise you that it's laying a strong foundation that in the coming years they will be able to do other things with so much more ease and joy. Look into open-ended toys. I'll try to post a list down below. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'm going to try to do a more regular live stream for answering questions. So your questions are really helpful to me. It helps me to get back in the mindset of being a young mom with young children. So many things I've forgotten about. So your questions help spur that memory on for me. So God bless you all, and I'll talk to you next time.